Good evening, welcome. Welcome to the official launch of the brand new book, Social Enterprise Law, Trust, Public Benefit, and Capital Markets by Professor Dana Brakman Reiser and Vice Dean and Professor Stephen Dean. Now, tonight is one of the many times when the reason, and maybe the most important reason, for a law school having a dean becomes obvious. And that is that if there were no dean, there could be no vice dean. And that matters because, after all, our vice deans are absolutely essential to running our school, and they're critical to its incredible success, which has been growing in leaps and bounds. Our program tonight features not one, but two vice deans, which underscores that my role is really to be a magnificent redundancy. And the two vice deans are the current probationer, Vice Dean, he's still on probation, newbie, Professor Stephen Dean, Dean, we like to call him, or R2D2, which he calls himself. That's true. And the other professor, Dana Brakman Reiser, who served recently in a long and very productive stint that oversaw a lot of change as vice dean. So we have two vice deans who are featured authors. Now, on the chance that you all are becoming as weary of narcissism as I am, you know what I'm talking about, and that the opposite may soon come into vogue because of what's happening in Washington, I'm going to continue in a dazzling exercise of self-deprecatory awareness, and I want to highlight just very briefly how exceptional it is that our featured authors have given such service to the school. First, that they perform so brilliantly and effectively as top administrators in a very challenging time, at a time of change, is a remarkable accomplishment in its own right, but the fact that they continue to be teachers while doing that, and such outstanding scholars in the forefront, I think, is really not to be taken for granted, and particularly exception. And the fact that they are such obviously passionate teachers and so involved in their scholarship, and yet they were willing in the service of our law school community to take on these big responsibilities, is something I think that is remarkable in terms of selflessness and a sense of service to community, and I don't want to miss an opportunity to tell them how grateful we are for that. Now, the extraordinary scholarship and teaching of our two featured authors tonight really represents and reflects the very best of Brooklyn Law School. It's exceptional, but it's not unusual to see the qualities that they exude in working together and with the rest of our faculty, the collegiality, the sense of purpose, and the devotion to their mission. Their passion for sharing their ideas with one another has resulted in many exciting joint projects, and it elevates the work of both of them, but also the work of others that are interested in participate, and also to their students, and it's bringing great distinction to our law school. Second, our faculty, like these two, are consistently on the cutting edge, the forefront of scholarship. They spot issues and they develop legal tools that are vital to the business community, to our larger society. Sometimes, as with this book, they even bring these two worlds together. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that our professor, Dana Brakman Reiser, has invented this field, or gave birth to this new field of law, and that Stephen Dean has been the midwife. And they have operated in bringing this big, beautiful baby, which is now growing in leaps and bounds, into the new world of law in the 21st century. It's a very important book. It's already garnering deserved considerable attention, and it's already been the #1 new release in both the business and corporate law books section on Amazon, for example. and not just because Stephen Dean keeps buying them, you know. Now, their topic, social enterprises and social enterprise law, which you're going to hear about tonight in detail, represents a new kind of business venture. And like other businesses, social enterprises pursue profits for their owners, but they also are dedicated to generating benefits for society. This dual mission creates many difficult challenges for social entrepreneurs and for the impact investors who might wish to fund them. The authors focus primarily on one of the challenges, helping social enterprises raise capital. They're going to tell you more about this challenge and their proposed solutions tonight with the expertise of our special guests. One, I guess, is going to be delayed, but I'm going to introduce him in any event. But first is David Porzio, class of 2006. He's going to talk about his experiences as a serial entrepreneur, and I don't think that means Wheaties or you know, sugar pops. I think it's S-E-R-I-A-L, entrepreneur, and is a founder and chief operating officer of Translator, a growing social enterprise. He's no stranger to the law school. Tomorrow he's going to be leading a brown bag luncheon for our students about the serial entrepreneur. If you want to have more, you haven't gotten enough tonight, come on by tomorrow, bring your own lunch. And he has been featured in our alumni magazine in the spring 2017 issue. Those issues have been selling like hotcakes, but you can still find a couple of copies downstairs on your way out. Ben Rader is the general counsel of Goldman Sachs Foundation. He's a good friend of the law school and our Center for Urban Business Entrepreneurship. And if he makes it here tonight, he's going to be helping tell us about the foundation, which has been a pioneer in impact investment, you know, impact for a good social purpose. So we're going to look forward to hearing what the authors and our guests have learned on the ground and to a lively discussion of this provocative and timely book. Thank you all for coming again. Please stay for the reception and the book signing. Books are flying off the shelves, but you can have a signed book by both authors, and you know its value in years to come is going to soar enormously, even more than your baseball card collections. So I'm going to now turn the program over to the professors and thank them very much for everything that they do for the law school. Thank you all.
So if we were smarter, we would have actually arranged this way, because the basic theme of our book is that we are trying to have social entrepreneurs help social entrepreneurs find investors. So we have our social entrepreneur here, and we're just waiting for the investor. Hopefully, as we talk, we'll lure him in with our brilliant ideas.
Yeah, I'm very used to this.
Yeah, I think this is sort of the
waiting for
the way
Goldman to show up is not not surprising.
This is I think the way the world works.
It is.
Indeed. So hopefully Ben will be here soon. But our plan for tonight was to start by sharing a little bit about the concept of the book, and particularly because we have such a varied audience here with us, and thank you all so much for coming from so many varied perspectives. It's great to have so many fellow colleagues and colleagues from other schools and staff members from here at Brooklyn Law School and friends and family, and it's just really very heartening to see, as well as many practicing lawyers who are the heroes of our book. So we're glad to see them too. So we want to start by talking about kind of the concept of the book, the overarching theme, and also by unpacking some of the terms that we're going to be talking about and that are important in the book because they're not necessarily intuitive. And it's, so that's our first stop. So as far as the overarching theme of the book, the concept is that we want to, as Dean Allard said, help social entrepreneurs to find the capital they need to scale their dual mission enterprises. They're enterprises that are pursuing a combination of financial return and social good. And if they want to scale those enterprises, they're going to need capital from outside investors. And we want to help get that to happen. And we come from the somewhat surprising perspective that law and lawyers can actually be the heroes in that scenario. So when you talk to a lot of business people about their ventures and then you tell them that you're a lawyer, they're pretty sure you're out to kill their dreams, right? Lawyers are the ones who say no. Lawyers are the ones who tell you it's not possible, and kind of stomp all over your big ideas. And we are here to say that that's not what lawyers are. That's not what the lawyers...
A good lawyer, anyway.
That's right. That's not what the lawyers we train at Brooklyn Law School are like.
No way.
And it's not what lawyers should aspire to be. Lawyers should be the ones who help make those dreams a reality and show you the path. And so we believe that the standard lawyer's toolbox, actually kind of the transactional lawyer's toolbox, can be a great place to start and to help entrepreneurs and investors find their way to each other. So that's the overarching theme of the book, and we'll unpack a lot more of that over the course of this evening. But to be able to understand those ideas, you have to get the two main players, right? The two main players are our social entrepreneur. What is it to be a social entrepreneur and have a social enterprise? And hopefully soon, you know, New York City Transit Authority, our impact investor, right? What does that mean to be an impact investor? So that's where we thought we would start. So Steve and I have a sense of social enterprise. Social enterprise law is the name of the book. We have a sense of what social enterprise is, thankfully. And our view is that it's a pretty big tent. That the idea is it's a venture, and the entrepreneur is the founder or group of founders behind the venture. And it's a venture that pursues a social mission using business methodology, right? And leaving room for profits for owners to be earned, unlike a charity, right? Which might pursue social good, but is not in the business of generating profits for owners.
Although, oddly enough, right? So it's not that a nonprofit, you say it, a charity can be very profitable, and you
Certainly.
probably know some, but they can't distribute it out to owners. They can't have owners that get those profits, so it's complicated.
Right. But a social enterprise wants to be able to earn those profits for owners, but also to generate social good. And that's kind of the first head scratcher that we encounter in our work, where people say, why would you do that? Who's the crazy person who's trying to make money off doing charity work? That seems pretty crazy. But if you think about it, there are actually a lot of examples that you're probably aware of. And so some of the ones that we talk about in the book are examples like ventures that make a product or provide a service that is of use to an underserved market. Right? So think about a company that develops an off-the-grid energy source, right, for use by individuals and communities who don't have access to the electrical grid, right? Well, that's serving a social mission, but it's also, many of those companies are organized as for-profit companies that can generate profits for owners. Or you probably have heard a little bit about the microfinance industry, for good or for ill. Right? But they are providing loans, right, to folks who are underbanked and have little access to credit. So that would be one type of example of a social enterprise.
And just to distinguish it from what you've all heard about, corporate social responsibility, right? So that is often dismissed as really just marketing for corporations that aren't just quite as evil as they might be, which isn't really an achievement. But this is something different than that. So there's something distinct from that.
Right. We also give some examples in the book of ventures that have kind of distinct employment models, right, that are seeking to employ hard-to-employ categories of employees, right? So one we like to talk about that's here in New York is Grayston Bakery. That has an open employment model. So you just put your name on the list, and whatever your skill set is and whatever your background is, your name comes up on the list, you get a job. Right? You don't necessarily keep the job. You know, you have to do well, but you get a chance, right, to have a job. And that's not how most employment models work, but it's part of their ethos as a company to have an open employment model. And you might also be familiar with small businesses that seek to employ folks who are recent immigrants or folks who are formerly incarcerated or youth that's at risk, right? Different kinds of entities like that. And everyone's probably by now heard of the one-for-one model, right? Where you have a consumer product where you buy the product and then it's bundled with a donation of that product to someone in need. So Tom's Shoes was the big, most prominent example of this, but you can find a one-for-one model from soccer balls to blankets to socks, eyeglasses, you name the product, you can find it out there. So those are also examples we talk about in the book. But we have our very own example here, right? So why don't you tell us about your social enterprise?
Translator. Translator is a system for making difference work at large organizations. It kind of came out of actually a long road. It started off as a not-for-profit. We created a social media site for the trans community. A good friend of mine who was the CEO of a software company called PeopleLinks, I had invested in that business, and she transitioned and she came to me because I was running Mind Body Green's product development, and she knew I could build community sites, so we built Trans Cafe, which was a site for the trans community to make trans lives easier, safer, and happier. What we realized as that went on was that corporations really wanted to understand the implications of the trans economy, and they wanted to get consulting on it. So we started to do that because we had contributors from all around the world that were experts in gender identity and stuff like that. And then as we were inside these larger corporations like McKinsey and Viacom, and we realized that they had a much larger problem around their diversity and inclusion initiatives, around equity in the workplace, and we kind of realized that none of the grievance systems worked, that was a very antiquated industry. Technology hadn't really come to the D&I space because people really didn't want to solve it. And so we built a solution which uses interactive training and VR on the training side. And then we have we're basically a support system for companies when problems and conflict come up in the workplace. So you can ask the translator bot any question around social issues, challenges you're having in the workplace, and you'll get a framework for how to manage that challenge. As you can imagine, it's difficult to do that one-to-one, so we're using some machine learning to scale that out as we grow. And yeah, so that's what Translator does very quickly.
Yeah. So you can see the immense breadth, right, of the world that you might call social enterprises, and we're trying to help folks of all sizes and organizational types and business models to find their way to the capital they need to scale their business returns and scale their social impact.
So when you, David, are thinking of the challenges you face as a social enterprise distinct from those of any other business,
right.
What are they?
Well, in our case, capitalization was a challenge. I think, quite frankly, having a trans woman CEO was interesting when we went to the Valley to raise money. So I think that there was like the issue of identity, especially around what was happening with the current administration. So like the new media, the new politics, kind of made it nasty. And even though people kind of wanted to help, I think that they were confused. Like, were we a political investment? Like, were we trying to actually solve a problem? We definitely were. We had the data to prove that none of these grievance systems, none of the diversity inclusion content was working. But I think people were just like, we really love what you're doing, but we're gonna it's really important, but we're gonna pass. And you get patted on the back a lot. But we realized, there were people that cared about this, and they weren't in my network. I'm a white cisgender male, right? So like my Valley contacts from my previous businesses didn't really work, but we found people that were aligned, and we ended up finding Tau Capital, Pritzker Family Office Fund, through Libra Fund, which is their social investment fund. So they do private investments, but they're not a for-profit fund, funded us. And then we found a B2B software investor in Osage Capital that recognized the scalability of what we were trying to do. But I could tell you a lot of, it was rough. And then we also looked for foundation money. I mean, there's a lot of, whether it's the Pinkerton Foundation or a number of other places where you'll get non-dilutive venture dollars. So we were all over the place.
Well, and all over the places where we try to direct our work, right? Because impact investors come in all different types, right? And our missing impact investor here, Ben Reiser, is
and we didn't make it up. I guess you're starting to think that, you're going to see as the night goes on, this is really the theme. And we did not set it up this way. It would work, but it wasn't part of our plan.
It wasn't the plan, but we're going with it. So he works for a foundation, right? And the Goldman Sachs Foundation has been very active in pursuing impact investment as part of its investment portfolio, right? A foundation is basically a large, hopefully, pot of money, right? And their goal is to invest that money so that they can distribute it out in grants to do good in the world. And a lot of them are trying to do that perpetually, right? And so they need to have investments so that when they grant out the money, they can replace, right, the money that's been granted out with new money that they earn on those investments. So foundations need to find investments, and they can invest in whatever they like, but a growing trend among foundations is to do at least some of their portfolio to do impact investment, to invest for a combination of financial return and social return. The Ford Foundation just recently committed to investing $1 out of its $12 billion in endowment into impact investment. And so the idea there is not that they're going to throw that money down the drain, right? They want to make a financial return, but they want to do so in a way that aligns with their values by finding investments that are going to generate a financial return and also have a social impact. Maybe investments like Translator.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, Translator is interesting because I think that it's a HR solution that will work. I really do believe that for a lot of larger corporations, just to manage conflict in the workplace. We think over time we're going to see people wanting to hire diversely rather than being forced into it. So I think that we have there's the initial impact that we have for our clients, which is going to allow them to solve problems in person. What's happening in companies is it used to be that conflict was one-to-one. It used to be that culture was built conversation to conversation. And now what's happening is you have a conflict with someone, and whether it's about sexual harassment or race or whatever, and they go to their social media profile, and the challenges are exacerbated. The conflict gets worse. And so what we're trying to do is actually have people use our tool to get frameworks to have that, to manage that conflict in person. So that's how we're going to build enterprise value. But over time, I think that we're trying to build more empathetic human beings, right? I think that I'd like corporations to start measuring not just in revenue and earnings, and I'm sure Ben would laugh, or Goldman. He's on this foundation, so he wouldn't laugh. But I think that we should start to think about how we measure growth differently. And I think that you speak to that numerous times in the book, because what's the point of this massive growth of all of these industries, of kind of merging with technology and everything, if we kind of lose ourselves and stop treating each other humanely. Anyway,
it's hard to argue with that.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Oh God. I'm on my soapbox. Sorry. But yeah. Anyway.
So, we talk about a lot of other possible investors too. Maybe you want to speak to that, Steve?
Sure. I mean, there are all sorts of different pots of money, and I'll give you an example of one that is just very different. So there are big foundations, and there are very small investors. But if you put enough small investors together, they can create a pretty big pool of money. And a buzzword you may have heard, but may not really understand what it is crowdfunding. So some of you have heard of crowdfunding. What does this mean? Yes, in a way it means people sitting around late at night in their jammies on their computers, deciding to buy stock, small amounts of stock in startups, but that's not all it is. But it really is a way of channeling small amounts of money from many, many people to fund ventures. And the beauty of it is, the power of the internet, they don't all have to be in the same place, right? So you could fund a startup this way by finding thousands, maybe more, tens of thousands of investors who find an idea, whether it's Translator or something else, that is somewhat unconventional. I would have a hard time, as David described, going to your standard investors and saying, we want to do this. They might say, I don't get it.
But
right?
did they limit the unaccredited investor amounts through those funds to $1 million, and like after the act? And how is you guys mentioned that? Did you think that that was a positive move from a protection standpoint in relation to how limiting that was?
Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So what David's referring to is, so you may have heard of crowdfunding in the sense of, your nephew has a Kickstarter campaign to, go to a rock concert or something like that, right? And
did that actually happen?
Well, I don't have a nephew,
okay.
But you might have. You can find stuff like that if you go look at Kickstarter, and it can be pretty fun. So there are lots of different kinds of crowdfunding, and the typical kind that you see on a site like Kickstarter is reward crowdfunding, right? So you might see a Kickstarter campaign by a band, and they say, if we reach our goal, if you contribute some funds to the money we need to produce our album, you'll be able to get a copy of the album, right? Or you'll be able to sing backup if you give us a lot, right? Or ride on the tour bus, right? Or something like that. It's a reward. It's not an investment, right? But there has been an interest in using crowdfunding for real investment where there's a financial return. But when you do that, you implicate the federal securities laws. Yikes, right? So some crowdfunding platforms kind of dabbled in this type of security, sorry to say for them, and they got in big trouble with the SEC. And then in 2012, Congress passes the Jobs Act, which is a big piece of legislation, but a part of it was directing the SEC to create some regulations to permit crowdfunding that was securities crowdfunding that would really provide for a kind of financial return for whoever's in their jammies, right, on these platforms, rather than just the reward. And in doing that, it was exciting, and people in Congress, some of them, were pretty excited about how this could open up capital, right, from small players to capitalize, especially small businesses, which was a lot of what the Jobs Act was about. But they were also really worried about fraud, right? Because if you're talking about trying to get a financial return and you're doing it in your jammies and it's with this Kickstarter, right? Who knows who that is? There was a concern about fraud. And so one of the ways that Congress kind of balanced and instructed the SEC to balance these two ideas of encouraging capital formation for small businesses and discouraging fraud was by limiting the amounts that could be spent on crowdfunding. And they did that both in terms of how much an individual investor could invest through crowdfunding. The amounts are quite small, so if you lose all your money, it's not that much, right? And they also limited the amounts that a company could overall raise using this crowdfunded security. And that number, it sounds like a lot to me, but it's really very small. It's $1 million. So if you want to use this equity crowdfunding, this kind of crowdfunding that's really for securities, you can only raise up to $1 million using that technique. And there's a lot of other concerns about this whole regulatory area that I won't get into, but as far as the $1 million, it means that for many businesses, if they can only raise $1 million, it's not worth it to go through the regulatory hurdles and the expense of running one of these capital campaigns through crowdfunding. So the jury's out on whether this will really be used very much for the capital formation purposes, and a lot of critics say it won't because it's too expensive to do the process of raising the money and you can only raise $1 million. But what we know so far, partially because of the excellent work of some lawyers in this area, including Rob Esposito, who's here, is that of the firms that have done crowdfunding in its short time here, because although the Jobs Act was passed in 2012, the regulations enabling this market took years to come out, so we have very little time where crowdfunding for this kind of securities crowdfunding has been available. For those companies that use it, social enterprises are really overrepresented. They are a big part of the group that's out there doing it. And so Steve and I talk in the book about this whole regime and how it has shifted and what the implications are for getting retail level investors to invest in social enterprises. But we find this stat that you see the overrepresentation of social enterprises, even in this constrained market with the $1 million raise limit, encouraging. That this is a place where very small enterprises who are after something not only capital, right? Not only generating financial returns, but they also want to take this message, right, about their social mission to the world, may find this technique more useful, right, than a straight standard forced profit small business might. So we don't think crowdfunding is the end-all, solution to capital for these enterprises, but we think it's one potential pathway, especially if some of these restrictions are loosened, which there's a lot of interest in doing, even outside the social enterprise area. So retail investors through crowdfunding is another place where you might see capital come in.
Exactly, and it just, to us, it illustrates the range of potential investors, as Dana was saying. So you've got Goldman Sachs, and you've got guys in their jammies in the middle of the night, and there's a lot in between. But of course, the problem here, and one way to think about this is that one bad outcome is not finding investors. Right? That's not so great. But perhaps worse is finding investors, right? So what happens then? Maybe we should talk about this before Ben gets here. So you're very fortunate. You find somebody who says, "Boy, I sure do believe in your mission. That's a wonderful mission. I really like that. Here's $1 million, which is not a lot, but let's just stipulate that it's appealing." Would you accept? I mean, the right amount. So if somebody shows up with the right amount of money. Is there, what would you want to ask them? What would you want to know about them?
If someone, it comes up all the time. People, I care a lot about who our investors are.
But their money's good, right? Why do you care if their money's good?
Because money creates attachment, and I'm going to have to deal with them in my life.
But yeah, so
it's not worth it. I've learned that the hard way. So what do you mean? Would you say that? So can you trust them always? I mean,
or what do you have to know to feel like you can trust them? On the one hand, they may be worried that you're not quite what you seem. You talked about investors not quite understanding whether you were a political cause,
right?
Masquerading as business,
right?
So if an investor says, "Boy, we sure love that mission, and we're not really worried about profit," we swear.
Yeah.
What do you have to know to be confident that they're not just shining you on?
No, this happened. I mean, we were offered money from a fund that I thought was making it for that reason, and we looked at their previous investments and we looked at their previous behavior and the type of deals that they had done, and we chose to turn it down. So yeah,
you turned away money.
We did.
That's crazy.
It's sometimes I still think it's crazy, like today, but I could use that money right now, but no, but I did, and I think that, but not everyone does, right?
And a big part of what the book's about, and this is relevant to both the big investors and the small investors question, is how do we get the investor side and the entrepreneur side to really understand each other? And the homework David describes is part of the story.
Yeah. Well, the chapter on measurement, so the thing that I love about the book, it goes well beyond like the legislative parameters that are set up or like the regulatory frameworks. It's about the technology that can be used to measure outcomes, right? Because that's ultimately, what is social enterprise investment anyway? Is it about a greener economy? Is it about creating diversity in the workplace? Like there's all of these different kinds of ideas around it. And then how do you measure that? And fortunately, we're at a technological place where that can happen in real time, and that was my favorite chapter in the book, by the way. So anyway,
All right, a vote for chapter 6.
Yeah. It's about all three of those factors, right?
And there are a lot of ways to try to. So at the heart of all of the different kinds of technologies that we advocate for building trust, there's a reason it's the first of the three items in the subtitle, because we think trust is critical to making all this work. They're just totally at random. One of the technologies we chose was tax law. I swear. just a coincidence that I'm obsessed with tax. But we use that not only because I'm obsessed with tax, but because there are a lot of ways to try to build the trust, to try to make sure that investors and entrepreneurs are on the same page, and you want them to show their true colors, right? As that investor did when they made their prior investments and acted rapaciously, presumably.
Right.
And were nice enough to leave a trail of their carnage, right, as they passed through those previous investments. But there are lots of ways you can do it. But at the root of all of them, whether it's a tax regime or a private contract or whatever it is, you have to be able to talk the same language.
Right.
Right. You have to be able to talk the same language. You know, it would be great if there were what referred to as the Rosetta Stone. Is there something that can translate in the same way that you have the real economic indicators that translate across all businesses? A return on investment. There are ways you can do that. What would you like to see? So what would your dream metric look like? So when you're talking to an investor trying to understand whether you really can understand each other, what are the things you'd want to be able to?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's tough because so many investors, particularly like large VC, are looking for a type of return. Like I had one venture capitalist say, like, we love the idea, we don't think it's a multi-billion-dollar space. So we won't invest in you. So like there's a large group of people that just like, and they would have been the wrong fit anyway. I think that we are a big, but they're immediately telling me unless I'm going to 10 billion that it's not worth their time. What am I looking for in investors? I'm looking for investors.
Well, what do you want to be able? So you want to be able to know. So they want to be able to measure. You want to be able to measure profits,
right,
first of all. But when you're trying to figure out what your social return should be, is it just? Is it always? Do you feel like it's always going to be sort of a idiosyncratic, bespoke way of measuring social return, or do you have any hope that you could have something that would apply to a green technology firm, to a translator, to the whole, to one-for-one organizations, or is it just too? Is everything just too unique?
It's a tough question. I'm not in the macro space right now. I'm like not investing in a lot of other companies. I'm really focused on operating this one. I think that you need like a third party to advance these metrics. I think that you need someone to say, like, in the green space, this is what a social enterprise in the energy space is required to throw off, right? For companies that are in the empathy development world, like, I need to show that we're not just, limiting conflict in the workplace, but I'm actually leading to more diverse workforces, right? So, I don't know. I think it's different for each enterprise, and I think it's challenging in that way. Also, a lot of investors, when it comes to social enterprise, they're just like, business is too hard. It's too hard, even just if you're going after it with no conscience whatsoever, and let alone when you're playing in a world where, anyway. So I don't know. Good question.
Well, the book tries to grapple with this issue, but spoiler alert, it doesn't come up with the Rosetta Stone. If we did,
don't tell them that, they're not going to buy it now.
Well, but it's discounted. So.
Okay, right, you can get it.
So, but we do talk about this question of what would be the right indicators, and that's not the business. Developing the indicators is not the business we set out for ourselves, but we try to report on some of the best current work going on in this space, some of which is being done by a group called B-Lab, which is very active in the social enterprise space. It does a lot of different things. One of the things that it does is develop metrics for judging what is a good company on various vectors. And it really tries to do this kind of across all businesses that are trying to pursue a social mission. But kind of as you would expect when they're trying to do that, it's hard to compare, right? So companies can earn their B certification as a kind of good company when they do lots of different kinds of things. So we talk about B-Lab's work, and we also talk about some other work in the area that's less evaluative and more kind of coming up with some foundational metrics where they just kind of are thinking about the accounting questions, kind of what do you count? Literally, what would you count if you were this kind of enterprise? And we think that all of those tools, as they get sharper, are going to really enhance what law can do. But we're so glad to be joined by Ben Reiser, our impact investor. We've been talking all night. Steve's been saying, we're trying to get the impact investor to the social enterprise, and now we have.
And this is exactly
It's
as we
success.
pictured it. I know. Yay!
This is probably when the impact investor shows up to the meeting.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
That's exactly what we're saying.
Absolutely.
And I was like, if we were smarter, we would have planned it this way. Make sure to come at.
Ben, we decided Goldman has to invest in my company.
We did.
Sorry.
We did.
Good.
We were actually just talking about metrics, which might be a good place to bring you into the conversation. When you're looking at investments, you might tell us a little bit about kind of what kind of impact investments Goldman does, and particularly this foundation does, and how you judge what's a good investment, both in putting in the money and as it goes along.
Sure. So we usually start, metrics is the starting point for us, really. So if you can tell that by some of the titles of the firm's initiatives. We have a 10,000 Women initiative, we have a 10,000 Small Businesses initiative. And so the point is to oftentimes to get to a set number of beneficiaries of the program. And they're usually, for 10,000 women, I think that's a good example to start out with. They are underserved women business entrepreneurs in developing countries, which is a population that is by definition, and especially depending on jurisdiction, extremely underserved. It's also, I think, as we talked in preparation for this event, it's an asset class that is untested partly because of those legal and business market hurdles. So the metrics are incredibly important from a number of different perspectives. They're important to make a base case for that asset class. They're important to prove that your philanthropic investment is actually having impact, what type of impact it is. So all of these things have to be analyzed and put up front. It seems a little quantitative and mathematic, but to title
It sounds a little heartless, I've got to tell you.
heartless is
No, I mean just the opposite, right? Because you're talking about underserved women in developing countries. That's the opposite.
No, I think it is, and I think adding the number to it gives it a power and gives it something that can bring other institutional investors in particular along, which was our purpose to leverage. There's such a huge credit gap in that space that in order to leverage other institutional investors, you have to make a very simple, strong statement. And our simple, strong statement was 10,000 women. And then when we approached the World Bank to try to close that credit gap for these same women entrepreneurs that we were educating, they were on board, and because they were on board and our firm was on board, institutional investors flocked to this facility, which is now gone way beyond its original $600 million target to provide capital to these women business people, women business owners in developing countries. So I think metrics comes first, and it certainly should be something that's built in on the demand side first too.
And in our book, we try to talk about those issues, but also to integrate this question of metrics into the legal tools, right, that are developed. And I wonder if that's something that you see in your investments in terms of, are there contractual requirements? Are there components of the investment that require feedback on the metrics? Do you have additional rounds, so to speak, kind of falling in when metrics are achieved? Have you seen deals like that?
Yes, we have seen deals like that, and we certainly build that in to our agreements with partners, who then in turn, for example, thinking about the 10,000 women example, build that into their agreements with the participating financial institutions in the developing countries that actually make the loans to the women entrepreneurs. And they, you know, we build in a lot of the grant money, besides being the first loss capital for the deal, creates incentives for financial institutions to lend to an asset class that otherwise is underfunded, but also once we start getting data back from the financial institutions, we can build in incentive payments to get to exactly the type of entrepreneur that we're looking to, or the type of business we're looking to. So, for example, if we want to see, you know, 75% businesses that have, you know, women management 50% or more, then we'll target that specific sector within our overall target.
So it sounds like you're really able to layer different types of investors into a project like 10,000 Women, right? So you've got the foundation capital. Thank you. So you have the foundation capital, right, that's going in under your direction, but then the idea is to bring in also these institutional investors who might not be other foundations, right, who are incentivized to participate because the foundation is the first loss capital.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and the legal agreements are critical in that respect, because there's a waterfall from all the investors, starting with the first loss piece, through the, you know, up through the very senior notes. And that's true of most products, including the social impact bonds, development impact bonds, which is another product that, that I've been working with on a pro bono legal basis at Goldman. And you know, I think all of those relationships are, of course, governed by legal agreements, and those happen to be that transaction cost of setting those kind of what can be pretty intricate layers up is a huge hurdle for social impact investment projects. So pro bono legal services in these areas is also critical. We've found to getting in new spaces, reaching new asset classes with social impact dollars.
So certainly at that level, it'd be hard for retail investors to get involved. This is not, you need something far beyond what they'd be able to muster to get involved in the space.
Yes, that's, yeah, right, exactly.
Understatement.
I mean, we work, for these projects now, we're working hardly ever, if ever, with a true retail base.
I mean, before you got here, we were talking about crowdfunding, which
right.
we sort of put at the opposite end of the spectrum from the large foundations.
Right.
It just underscoring how hard it would be to reach them without some sort of ready-made system of identifying, allowing social enterprises and social enterprise investors, impact investors, to identify themselves. Because otherwise, they would need all these agreements you're talking about,
True.
which would be very hard to.
But even in those kind of smaller investor spaces, we think that the community is facing similar problems in terms of, you know, you need to come up with relatively complex structures to kind of manage these dual mission concerns between investors and entrepreneurs. But the cost of lawyering, right, that level of sophistication might overwhelm, right, the size of the deal. And you're facing that same problem. You've got the foundation. It's part of your charitable activity to, you know, help facilitate deals like this so eventually they can be replicated. Part of what we're doing in our work is providing frameworks that we hope will be simple and clear enough that they could be developed for kind of replication in a kind of off-the-rack type dynamic.
Even for folks in their jammies.
Yes, always. I mean, we care a lot about them.
We do. Am I tired? Maybe I'm tired. Talking
all
about
the
jammies.
time. You're up all night.
Yeah, that's true.
So I guess there are two more topics that we should probably cover, and one is really connected to this question of off the rack, which is there's been a lot of activity on the legal side directed at social enterprise in creating off-the-rack, standardized, new organizational forms that are supposed to make it safe, right, for someone to start a social enterprise and someone to invest in a social enterprise, and to know if the venture takes on this specialized legal form that they can trust it's a good quality social enterprise, that the investors who come in will be committed to social mission, and that the entrepreneurs who adopt it will be committed as well. Probably the most prolific of these is the benefit corporation. Did you think about doing that?
No, I did not think about it at all. I just think I mean, to me, it's still a marketing tool. And for so many companies that use it, I think it is a marketing tool. There's just, I mean, I'm in the early, stages, right? So I've been doing, trying to grow companies. I've gotten a couple past the Series A stage and one further along. And I just can't think about that this early. I maybe if I had, we was putting a bunch of my own money in, and it was like a large, $5 or $10 million early stage company. But when you're at that seed stage where it's $500,000 and 3 or 4 employees, I just don't know if a B Corp is the way to go. I mean, and do you see a lot of seed stage companies taking on? I mean, you guys, I don't know if you do any seed deals anywhere. But
Yeah, we haven't in particular.
Right. It's really probably when they're getting out into Series A or Series B, when they have some scale and maybe a few $1 million in revenue, that I think that would be attractive. Yeah.
Why do you think it would be more attractive if they had more market cap?
I think just from the legal requirements. I mean,
I see.
I just don't. If I'm gonna, even I have 3 BLS interns working with us right now, and I have.
Awesome. Keep hiring.
Yeah, and so we have, we're like an employee resource that where there's questions going back and forth around maybe some serious issues, mental health issues or whatever. So I'm trying to understand what my legal responsibilities are. How do I coordinate, telling the mental health professional or the companies, even though my service is supposed to be, confidential. So and that's just one of many, many things I'm worried about.
It's not a headache you want to take on.
Yeah, and so like to go the B Corp route as a market, I mean, and I don't think people care. Like it's embedded in who we are, that we're, I think, like an empathetic, positive organization run by a trans woman. A B Corp stamp of approval does nothing for us, honestly.
You said you don't see a lot of them in the space. I mean, that's been our sense as well.
And are we talking, so one thing that's pretty confusing here, you have 2 concepts that are really related. There's benefit corporations that are the state law corporate forms, and then there's certified B Corp. So there's the certifier B Labs that will, undergo a whole vetting process and declare you a B Corp. But I think we're talking about benefit corporations in here, and so you don't see a lot of those, and David, you don't see a lot of appeal of either the benefit corp or the B Corp.
I don't the B Corp.
No, that's
I don't. For me, as an entrepreneur, that's like trying to just make it happen. When you're trying to like grab clients and you're trying to hire and you're trying to create systems for onboarding,
you're trying to make it work, right?
Yeah, you're just trying to make it work. But maybe that's also because this particular company's in the HR space. Maybe if I was, a retail company or an e-commerce,
more consumer-facing,
where I was more consumer-facing, where I could put it on a label, and that was a differentiated proposition as a conscious company. Yeah, like sure. But even as a social enterprise, I have some issues with the social what does it mean to be a social enterprise? I think so. Coming from advertising and marketing world, right? It's so quickly, people becomes a marketing gimmick. People start to manipulate, whether or not they're actually delivering on the promise and.
Without the metrics, right? So this is why Ben has these very straightforward metrics of 10,000 women. You want to.
We're not going to substitute being a benefit corporation for any of those.
Right. Sure.
Yet.
And I also feel like the landscape has moved a bit underneath, right? The whole B Corp idea. So with the ESG and corporate social responsibility movements, they have just moved essentially the entire ground beneath a lot of that legislation in a way. I mean, certainly the discussion in C-suites and in startups to large public companies is a much different one on environmental, social governance areas than it was even 5 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago. Or I'm not sure on the dates for the B Corp legislation, but.
Yeah, I mean, so our book takes the position that this is changing, and that these new organizational forms have been part of the conversation and kind of raised the awareness about these issues. But from what we can find in the existing data, there's not a lot of uptake by actual businesses. Actual businesses seem to be in the position of Translator, who say, I don't need that. I'm the kind of business I am because of the way I run my business. And taking on a special form is not going to help me to stay that kind of business, at least not the way that they're currently constructed, because there's not a lot of enforcement mechanisms in these organizational forms.
Although at least 36 states, including Delaware, have a benefit corporation.
So they're on the books. They've done massively well as a legislative product, which is not really surprising because there's no cost and it appeals to both sides of the aisle, right? We're going to be really progressive and solve social problems, but we're doing it with business.
Right.
I mean, they passed in like 20 legislatures by unanimous votes in the states, right? So of course no one's using it. It's useless. If everyone agrees, it must be useless.
And also for early stage companies, so say that there was a tax benefit. When you're early and you're either pre-revenue or you're only a few million in revenue, and you're losing money anyway, right? You're running an operating loss.
You don't have a tax
You don't have a tax
I mean, you could make it a refundable credit, but I'll forget I said that. That's not for today.
But these don't come with any kind of tax enhancement.
If they were tied to government subsidies, maybe.
Yeah. So our book takes the position that while these have been kind of a useful bit of consciousness raising, we don't think that they're going to be the kind of transformative law for social enterprises and helping impact investors and social enterprises find and trust each other, that they're not sufficient solutions, and that things like designing specialized financial products and revealing your preferences to each other through the negotiation about metrics, and even planning for the exit strategy that makes the most sense, is going to be a better set of tools for getting the entrepreneurs and investors to sync up.
And so, the lawyer in me always thinks about the worst possible thing that could happen, right? That's just how we're wired. But do you guys focus on exit? Is that something you're thinking about as you're making investments or planning your venture? Is it on the radar screen for you?
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we focus on developing. I mean, kind of taking a step back on looking to how a project can be replicated, but then also looking to how are we going to move to our next project. How is this asset class going to be attractive to investors such that we can then go on to leverage the next space? Because that's if you're trying to open up, especially in the capital access area, if you're trying to open up a new asset class or a new space, then you're always thinking about the next one or how to make that space attractive enough that it can be liquid. It can be liquid.
I mean, you want to be a catalyst,
yeah,
right?
Catalyst,
you really want to be
sure.
a catalyst, not really be locked into any one venture or even asset class.
That's for sure. Yeah,
that's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think about exit a little bit differently. I think about it in terms of my product development roadmap. So, like, my partner is speaking at Salesforce, and we have this thing at Dreamforce, and Tony Profits, their chief quality officer, and like they're very focused on this space. So I want to integrate. We have a Salesforce app done, and then there's a few other companies that I think about. Because they'll help me scale because it's part of their. If I believe them, it's part of their mission to scale companies like me. But then also, if it's an option to sell to them.
Right. So exit could be a way to actually scale your impact even more widely, right? Or it could be a way to completely sell out. Right? And so we talk about in the book how actually, surprisingly, again, negotiating and developing the legal framework that is going to govern that exit is going to help you identify what everyone's preferences are and what their commitments are. And so even exit, which is kind of the boogeyman a lot of the time when you talk to social entrepreneurs, we think actually is a moment you should be thinking about from the beginning, planning for.
Oh, for sure. And I feel like one of the reasons why the nonprofit sector in the US, even though it's so much more pronounced than in other countries, hasn't given us the social change that we want is because there is no exit. There's no exit from a nonprofit.
That's
right?
true.
I mean,
it's true. Right? And we also make the point in the book that these are not charities, right? They're not nonprofits.
Right.
The assets are not locked in. And we're talking about potentially trillions of dollars of capital. It doesn't have to be locked in forever to do a lot of good. If we could rent some trillions for a little while to do good, that would be good.
And around my space, so like the diversity and inclusion space I've learned a lot about, and there's companies like Andela that are recruiting African engineers. They've raised a lot lot of money and are having a lot of success. But then there's not.
Is that one of the first Chan Zuckerberg investments?
Yeah,
it
that's
was.
right. And then there's companies that are going to become for-profit companies. So like All Star Code, which is is Black and brown engineers that are getting kind of placed at top companies all over the. Like they're training them and then they're getting placed all over the country at top tech firms. They're going to go for profit. And I think it's from just the money raising in that space to like do the dinners and then to find a pipeline, and it's just you'd rather just make money.
Fair enough. And if that's what you want to do, there's nothing wrong with that, right? We're capitalists too. I think it's time that we should open up to the audience. If we have a lot of really informed audience members and some who might want more information. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We're all being recorded, so wait for the microphone to come to you. But anyone have a question for anyone on the panel? We've got right here, Professor Mulligan. Use the microphone, but it's not working. Should it be loud?
Hello?
There you go.
All right. I was wondering if you could talk about the supposed tension between trying to maximize your profits and trying to create a company that has mixed goals. And so there's the impression that you kind of can't do that very easily, either for structural reasons or legal reasons. And so if you could talk a little about that and how the law can help resolve it, that would be awesome.
Sure. Do you want to?
Well, sure. I also would love to hear from our guests. Do you see that tension? Do you feel that tension in the work you do and the investments you make and the business you're running, that there is that real tension between trying to create a balance and I guess rapacious capitalism?
Yeah, I think it's the challenge.
Excellent.
I think it's a challenge. I mean,
More work for us.
yeah, I mean, like for my company, we're trying to create more diverse work environments, and we're trying to also manage conflict in the workplace. But just from a hiring perspective, we're a young company, and we need to hire the best talent. But we also want to be very careful, and we want to consider we want to create a system for hiring that isn't going to just be my friends and my connections. So I'm trying to look at our company, 5 years out, what type of recruiting are we going to do? And so it's challenging. I want to hire diversely, but I also have, my perspective is narrow. My network's narrow. So yeah, that's one way it comes up right away for me.
And so I'll just to link it to, yes, of course, Professor Dean, that's a silly question. But just to respond, circle back to Professor Mulligan's question, there are things that the law, not necessarily legislatures can do, but one of the things we propose, not in the book, but we've been working even after the book. Right. We have another.
We haven't had enough of each other.
It's really crazy. But we have another way that employees, right? So everybody knows about stock options, right? So you could create a sort of a quirky stock option that would allow you to attract employees, not by paying them the highest salary, but by showing your devotion to balancing mission and profit. Right. So the way it would basically work, if the owners, the entrepreneurs who own all the shares, decide to sell out, the employees' stock options vest and they take the company. Right. So you can build legal frameworks that will, again, come back to the notion of trust, that will allow David to hire employees, look in the eye and say, we really mean it, and we can prove it, right? This is really the kind of company and I know it because I am the company, but I can prove it to you because here are these options that, let you, demonstrate that, hold me to it.
Yeah, and I think the kind of basic kind of foundational point in your question is about, well, can a standard corporation do all of these things, right? Can they really marry mission and profit if you're just a standard, regular, maybe Delaware corporation? And there's a big debate about that in corporate law, which I spend a lot of time in my corporations class talking about. Thank you all for coming. Some of my students are here. My own view is that there's a whole lot of room to do that in an ordinary corporation, even in Delaware, unless you're talking about the end game of the corporation where there's a takeover at stake. And then the Delaware courts have been very clear that you have to focus on shareholder profit. But outside of that context, for a variety of reasons, including the deference that's paid to the management of corporations, I think there's tremendous room for corporations to kind of balance mission, social mission, and profit making. And then there's the practical question, right? Because I don't actually think law is the big problem in the issue that you're raising. It's a practical question, and that's why you care who your investors are, right? Because if you're a small corporation that has investors that are just as committed to the social mission as you are, you're never going to experience any challenge to your decision to favor mission over profit making. So that's kind of another way. And if you're talking about something like a large publicly traded corporation that's subject to the takeover markets, that's a very different story. But it's a different story because of who their investors are and what their investors are expecting. Not really because the law, at every moment is telling you maximize profits, maximize profits.
It's not?
You often hear that, but I keep looking, and it's not in the case law, and it's not in the statutes.
We'll see if distributed ledger technology also helps with this, right? Because you're talking about trust. A lot of our challenges that we have to trust banking systems, and 20% of GDP or something like that goes to the trust mechanisms that govern how money flows, right? So maybe crypto has an answer to this in the problem of the commons, and maybe that should be part of your next.
Maybe new more topics. Okay, we've got some folks over here. Oh yeah, go ahead. Oh, someone already has a mic over there. We'll come to you. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay. Let's fight about it.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you. This is very interesting. And I have a question with regards to metrics. As you know, it's a very hot topic, especially when we're talking about social as well as for profit. How do you determine and how do you determine what's a successful metric in terms of the social? How do you determine what's successful in terms of the profit? Do you blend them? If you could all touch a little bit about that.
Ben, you want
Yeah,
to
you should. I think this is.
Sure. Well, it's a good question, and it's also I think the whole philosophy behind metrics is can be a very complicated one. There's certainly, just as a kind of practical tip of how foundations typically do it, they hire consultants. There are a lot of good nonprofit and for-profit consultants in the philanthropy space. And so we certainly use them to help identify within areas of social impact what a good and measured M&E metrics and evaluation system is. So that should be tailored to the project. It should be tailored to in some cases to the investors, what the investors are thinking, but also tailored to this space itself. So, for example, with the our 10,000 Small Businesses program, we're looking at number of jobs created. We're looking at revenue growth for these underserved small businesses, and so whereas if you're looking at mosquito nets, reducing cases of malaria, you'll want to have a whole different system developed. Or if you're doing a development impact bond for water infrastructure, like some people are working on, you'll want to tailor that as well. So I don't know if that's a good answer.
Right. Can we go back to?
Yes, I'm a James student here, and it's kind of in relation to the question of profit and then social good and benefit corporations, or Delaware PBC in particular. If it is built into your corporate structure, is that an extra layer of protection kind of against this question of being beholden to a stockholder versus a shareholder? And is that an idea to be a benefit corporation, or do you still think that benefit corporations aren't worth the paper they're written on?
Well, so it's great that you asked this question, because we actually have an op-ed out today that responds to this issue. And
this wasn't a planted.
Thank you so much. And there are copies around, so if you want to take a look at it. But it's really the question of, well, will forming as a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation, which is one of these specialized forms, is that going to help, to really help a company to hew to its social mission? And we take the example of Uber, right? Uber's having a lot of problems, right? They tried to hire Sheryl Sandberg to show that they were going to really, value women. She said no, right? Could they become a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation and say that the public benefit they were going to pursue was gender equality or respect for women or something like that? Would that do it? Would that make sure that they were going to follow that mission? And what we say is, well, if they want to do that, that would be a great way of broadcasting their commitment, but it's not a really good way of enforcing that commitment, because the way these benefit corporation, both the Delaware form and the form in other states, the way that they're set up is that directors, once they take on this mantle of the specialized form, they have to consider their public benefit alongside considering profit, or they have to balance the public benefit alongside considering profit, and there's no requirement that they prioritize in any of those decisions, right? So yes, we've thought about women, and we're going to value men more today, right? So that would be perfectly okay in a benefit corporation. So we don't think that it can substitute for the commitment of the management and the commitment of the investors, right? Because investors also can throw it off, right? They can get rid of it by a 2/3 vote if they want to get out of that designation and become a regular corporation again, right? So without the commitment of investors and the commitment of management, we don't think it's enough. It's not a bad thing.
This is exactly what David was saying, right? So David says, well, what, we don't need to wear that hat, right? We know we're that. We don't need to show it.
Yeah.
But maybe if you were in the consumer space, you might.
But also there's, in the diversity and inclusion space, right, where a lot of companies just game the system, right? They'll just hire, in that year enough where they're showing a growth in women in the workplace, or like women in VP and above levels.
Well, that shows a weakness in at least the metrics we have, right? So if you have metrics, in school, teaching to the test, right? Are you worried that people are going to just make the metrics seem good? Is this something you run into in your work? The 10,000 Women initiative seems pretty hard to gain. I mean, if you brought credit to 10,000 underserved women, that's pretty hard to argue with. Is that something you're concerned about, or you feel like you've got that under control, the problem of designing a game-proof metric?
No, I definitely think that's something that we think about, and certainly if there is a kind of leeway for fudging or for trying to get around the the actual problem that you're addressing, I think that undercuts the project a lot. So.
Of course. Well, there's obviously a lot more to talk about. Luckily, there's food and drink downstairs and books, discounted books available for signatures. So we thank our guests again, David and Ben, for joining us, and all of you.
Thank you, guys.